At my father's funeral in Chicago, I learned how thin respect can be when people think you have nothing left. My wife's family didn't whisper their contempt. They said it out loud, standing close enough for me to hear, close enough for it to sting. I stayed quiet, not because I agreed, but because I thought silence would keep the peace. It didn't. And if you've ever stayed quiet to survive a family moment, you already know how this kind of story begins. I had already been awake for hours before we reached the funeral home, answering work messages I should have ignored, and making sure bills scheduled for the week were still covered. That habit had been with me for years, keeping things moving, making sure nothing collapsed just because I slowed down. My job demanded that kind of steadiness, and so did my marriage. I paid, planned, fixed, absorbed. It was easier than explaining myself. The place filled quickly. Both say I hadn't seen in years nodded at me, some with genuine sympathy, others with the polite distance people use when they don't know what to say to a black man in a dark suit who looks like he's holding too much inside. I stood near my wife, close enough to show unity, far enough to breathe. My father lay still a few feet away, and I kept my eyes off him because if I looked too long, I knew I'd lose control of the careful balance I'd built. Her family arrived together, loud in the way people get when they mistake familiarity for ownership. Hugs came late, if at all. A hand clapped my shoulder harder than necessary. Someone joked about how quiet I looked, asked if I was still managing, now that my last safety net was gone. I didn't respond. Silence had always been my way of preventing scenes. As more people gathered, the comments sharpened. A remark about how my father hadn't left much behind. A laugh about how some men never really build anything. One of them leaned in and said it plainly, not bothering to lower their voice, that now I was truly on my own. No father, no backup, just a man pretending to hold it together. I stood there, feeling every word land, choosing not to react, not for them, not for my wife, not in front of my father. I told myself this wasn't the time, that dignity meant endurance, that swallowing anger was the same as being strong. The service moved forward, prayers were said, stories were shared that skimmed the surface of who my father had been. I listened, nodding when expected, my jaw tight. He had taught me early that men didn't announce their plans, they executed them. He also taught me to take responsibility, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. When it was over, people drifted away in clusters. Her family lingered, still talking, still circling, as if this moment belonged to them. Another comment followed me as I turned to leave. Something about how life would get harder now, how some people just weren't built to stand alone. I felt my wife tense beside me but say nothing. Neither did I. Outside, the air cut sharper than I expected. I walked toward the parking lot without looking back, my hands clenched inside my coat pockets. I told myself again that staying quiet had been the right choice, that peace mattered more than pride, that this day wasn't about me. Halfway to the car, that thought cracked. Not loudly, not all at once. It came as a simple realization that settled into my chest and refused to move. Silence hadn't protected anyone. It hadn't honored my father. It hadn't preserved my marriage. All it had done was teach people how far they could go with me. I unlocked the car, paused with my hand still on the door, and noticed how familiar that pause felt. Always waiting, always absorbing, always preparing to carry more than my share. The noise from behind me continued, their voices drifting across the lot, and I stayed where I was for a moment longer, staring down at my keys, knowing I would drive away like I always did, knowing something had shifted, even if I wasn't ready to name it yet. The next morning didn't wait for me to catch up. Messages stacked up before sunrise, some from work, others from people who hadn't spoken to me in years. A few offered condolences. Most felt like check-ins disguised as concern, the kind that quietly measure how much ground you've lost. I answered what mattered, skipped the rest, and left the house earlier than usual. The routine helped. Movement always did. At the office, conversations shifted when I walked by. No one said anything outright, but the tone had changed. A question about timelines carried an edge. A comment about budgets lingered longer than necessary. Someone asked if I was doing okay, in a way that suggested they already had their own answer. News travels fast when people think a man's footing is gone. By midday, it was clear the funeral hadn't stayed where it belonged. Her family had talked. Not directly to me, of course. They never did. Stories filtered through cousins, neighbors, even a mutual acquaintance who thought passing along gossip counted as kindness. My father hadn't left much. I was struggling. The marriage was under strain. It amazed me how confidently people spoke about things they knew nothing about. At home that evening, the silence felt heavier than before. My wife moved around the kitchen, busy with small tasks that didn't need doing. When I mentioned what I'd heard, she sighed, not in surprise, but in irritation. She said I was reading too much into it, that families talked, that letting it go would be easier than confronting anyone. The words landed softly, but they landed all the same. I wanted to argue. Instead, I nodded and let the conversation drift. Keeping the peace had become instinct. Years of smoothing things over had trained me well. Still, something resisted this time. The feeling didn't explode. It pressed inward, steady and persistent, like a question refusing to be ignored. Over the next few days, the pressure grew. Invitations stopped. Calls went unanswered. When I did show up somewhere, smiles tightened. I could feel myself being repositioned, quietly, carefully, as someone no longer central, no longer necessary. The humiliation from the funeral had taken on a wider shape, wrapping itself around routines I'd once taken for granted. One night, after another long day of pretending nothing was wrong, I met Marcus for coffee. We'd worked together years ago, before he left to start his own consulting firm. He listened more than he talked, always had. I told him what had been happening without dressing it up. No anger, no drama, just facts laid out in the order they'd occurred. He didn't rush to reassure me. He didn't tell me it would pass. He asked one question instead, whether staying quiet was protecting my marriage, or just making it easier for everyone else to decide who I was. The way he said it stuck. Calm, direct, uncomfortable in the right way. We talked a bit longer about work, about nothing in particular. When we parted, there was no resolution, no plan, just that question echoing louder than before. I drove away with it riding beside me, filling the space where I usually kept excuses. The freeway stretched ahead as the city thinned out. Suburbs gave way to darker stretches of road, familiar exits slipping past without thought. I replayed moments from the funeral, then from the days after, noticing details I'd dismissed at the time, the certainty in their voices, the ease with which they spoke over me, my own readiness to absorb it. I told myself again that letting it go would be simpler, that confrontation would only make things messier. Yet the more I leaned on that reasoning, the hollower it sounded. Silence hadn't stopped the rumors. It hadn't preserved respect. It had only made me invisible in rooms where I'd once stood firmly. A notification buzzed on my phone at a red light. Another message forwarded from someone who thought I should be aware of what was being said. I didn't open it. The light changed and I kept driving, hands steady on the wheel, mind moving faster than the road beneath me. By the time I reached the outskirts of town, fatigue settled in, the kind that doesn't come from lack of sleep. It comes from carrying something too long without setting it down. I pulled into a gas station, filled the tank, and stood there longer than necessary, watching numbers climb while my thoughts circled. This wasn't about pride. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about boundaries I'd never drawn because I'd confused endurance with integrity. The realization didn't arrive as a declaration. It surfaced quietly, like an acknowledgement I could no longer avoid. I got back in the car and merged onto the road again, the question Marcus had asked still hanging between breaths, following me as the miles rolled on, refusing to settle, refusing to fade, staying close as I drove deeper into the suburbs and toward whatever came next. The email arrived between two routine reports, buried enough that I almost missed it. A woman I didn't recognize used my full name, spelled correctly, which already set it apart. She said she had known my father years ago through a community investment group and had attended the funeral from a distance. There was something she thought I should look into. Nothing urgent, just a detail that didn't sit right with her. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I reread the message later that night, then again the next morning. It wasn't dramatic, no accusations, just a reference to paperwork my father had signed months before he died, documents connected to assets I'd been told didn't exist. The phrasing stayed cautious, almost reluctant, like she wasn't sure she should have reached out at all. That hesitation made me curious. I searched through my father's old emails, the ones I'd archived without much thought. Most were ordinary, appointments, short notes, reminders written in his clipped style. A few stood out, mentions of meetings I didn't remember him talking about, attachments I hadn't opened before. Nothing conclusive, but enough to unsettle the version of events I'd been handed so confidently. At home, questions met resistance. I asked about the lawyer who had handled my father's affairs, only to be told that everything had already been dealt with. When I pressed for names or copies, the conversation shifted. I was accused of stirring trouble, of looking for problems where there were none. The tone carried a warning wrapped in concern. Access closed off quickly after that. Calls went unanswered. Emails about legal matters received vague replies or none at all. Information I'd once been included in by default now required permission. The change happened so smoothly, it might have gone unnoticed if I hadn't been paying attention. Doubt crept in from an unexpected angle. Maybe I was misreading things. Grief can distort judgment. Stress can invent meaning where there is none. I caught myself questioning my own reactions, replaying conversations to see if I'd imagined the tension. That uncertainty did more damage than anger ever could. Still, something insisted on being examined. I began saving everything. Emails went into folders labeled by date. Text messages were backed up. Phone calls earned brief notes afterward. Nothing elaborate, just times, names, and what was said. It felt strange at first, like crossing a line I'd never considered before, but the act itself brought a small sense of order. I also stopped sharing. Not completely, just selectively. Fewer details about my schedule, less transparency around finances. A boundary drawn so lightly, it was almost invisible. Yet it changed how conversations unfolded. People noticed. Questions followed. Explanations were expected. I offered none. Another message came from the same woman, this time with an attachment. A scanned document, partially obscured, bearing my father's signature. It referenced a trust, one I'd never heard mentioned. The date sat there, plainly, unmistakable. My chest tightened, not with excitement, but with the weight of realization. Either I'd been kept in the dark deliberately, or everyone else had been. Both options carried consequences. I didn't confront anyone. That urge surfaced briefly, then passed. Experience had taught me that asking the wrong questions too soon only alerted people to hide things better. Instead, I forwarded the document to myself at a separate address and continued as if nothing had changed. Days took on a different rhythm. Ordinary tasks required more focus. Conversations demanded restraint. I watched how easily narratives formed and how quickly they hardened into truth once repeated enough times. The ease with which I'd been repositioned still surprised me. Late one evening, needing space, I pulled off the highway and stepped into a cafe that stayed open past midnight. It wasn't busy. A few scattered customers, none paying attention. I ordered coffee I didn't really want and took a seat by myself, spreading my notes across the table like someone pretending to work. Patterns began to emerge. Dates aligned. Gaps made sense. Pieces I'd dismissed as coincidence arranged themselves into something closer to intention. My father hadn't been careless. He'd been quiet. There was a difference. The thought unsettled me more than any insult at the funeral. If he had planned, then someone else had known. If someone else had known, then the ignorance I'd been expected to accept wasn't accidental. A message buzzed on my phone while I was still sorting through that realization, a reminder from work. I responded automatically, then slipped the phone back into my pocket. Life didn't pause just because understanding was catching up. I gathered my papers, folded them neatly, and tucked them away. No conclusions yet, no moves that couldn't be undone, just attention, sharpened and deliberate. As I left the cafe and returned to the car, the familiar sense of stability I'd relied on for years felt thinner, stretched across too many assumptions. I started the engine, already planning the next small step, not toward confrontation, but toward clarity, letting the road carry me forward while the shape of things continued to shift quietly in the background. The call came while I was reviewing a routine contract, the kind I'd approved dozens of times before. My phone buzzed once, then again, until I stepped out of my office and answered. The voice on the other end belonged to someone from our extended circle, careful and formal, asking whether I was aware of the concerns being raised about my judgment lately. The phrasing was polite, the implication wasn't. By the time I returned to my desk, the shift was already underway. An email had gone out to a small group, copied wider than necessary, questioning whether I should remain involved in a community board I'd served on for years. Nothing accusatory on the surface, just questions, framed as responsibility and transparency. I recognized the language immediately. It was the same tone my in-laws used when they wanted to look reasonable while cutting someone at the knees. I didn't respond, not yet. Silence, when chosen carefully, still had value. Later that afternoon, the second strike landed. A call from the bank, brief and procedural, informing me that a joint account tied to family matters was temporarily restricted pending clarification. No accusations, just policy. The timing wasn't accidental. I thanked the representative, asked what documentation would be needed, and ended the call without letting anything show. Word traveled faster than facts. People I barely spoke to felt comfortable weighing in. Some offered advice I hadn't asked for. Others pulled back entirely, as if association itself had become risky. My name floated through conversations I wasn't part of, reshaped by people who benefited from my absence. At home, explanations turned sharp. I was told this could have been avoided if I'd stayed quiet, that digging into the past only made everyone uncomfortable, that my questions had consequences. The argument circled without resolution, each sentence designed to return responsibility to me. I listened, responded minimally, and excused myself before the conversation could turn uglier. That evening, I attended a small gathering I'd already committed to. Walking into the room felt different this time. Smiles came slower. Handshakes loosened early. Someone mentioned the situation with an apologetic shrug, as if it were already settled fact. I corrected nothing. Watching assumptions form in real time taught me more than any defense could have. The next few days tightened the vice. Access narrowed further. Decisions that once included me moved forward without notice. A project I'd helped build was suddenly being reconsidered, my role framed as provisional. It wasn't chaos, it was methodical, each move plausible on its own. Together, they formed a clear picture. I adjusted quietly. I rerouted automatic payments, shifted funds that were still under my control, documented every interaction with care that bordered on tedious. When asked for statements, I provided only what was required, no more, no less. Strategy replaced reaction. Still, the weight accumulated. Losing money stung less than watching trust dissolve so easily. Reputation takes years to earn and minutes to question. I'd always known that. Feeling it firsthand was different. One night, after another day of measured responses and unanswered messages, I drove back to the apartment I kept in the suburbs for work. It wasn't fancy, just a place to sleep and reset. I dropped my bag by the door, loosened my tie, and sat down without turning on the television. The quiet there was honest, no undercurrents, no performances. I reviewed the notes I'd been keeping, reading them straight through for the first time. Patterns stood out more clearly now. The timing of the bank issue, the board email, the way certain people spoke as if they already knew the outcome they wanted. This wasn't panic on their part, it was confidence. That realization settled heavier than the financial hit. They believed I would absorb this too, that I'd recalibrate, accept less. Another message forwarded from someone who thought I should see what was being said. I didn't open it. Instead, I placed the phone face down on the table and went to the kitchen to pour a glass of water. Standing there, I noticed how automatic my restraint had become, how quickly I defaulted to minimizing myself to keep others comfortable. The habit had served me in some places. It was costing me everywhere else. I returned to the table and opened my laptop, not to respond or defend, but to check a calendar entry I'd set weeks earlier. A meeting I hadn't canceled, a conversation I'd planned to have and postponed twice already. The cursor blinked while I reread the details, considering what I would say and what I would withhold. Outside, a car passed on the street below. Inside, the apartment remained still. I took another sip of water, then reached for my phone again, this time to draft a short message confirming my attendance, keeping the wording neutral, precise, and necessary, before setting the device back down and turning my attention to what still needed to be done. The message came from an address that didn't carry a name, just a string of numbers and a free email domain. No greeting, no explanation. A single line asked whether I remembered the year my father stopped talking about a partnership he'd once believed in. Below it sat a scanned note in his handwriting, dated far earlier than anyone had admitted, referencing disputes, delays, and a decision to let time expose what people hide. I stared at it longer than I should have. That year surfaced quickly. I'd been busy then, buried in work and marriage, assuming his silence meant exhaustion or age. I remembered how he'd brushed off questions, how he'd redirected conversations towards safer ground. At the time, I'd taken that restraint as acceptance. Now it read differently. More fragments followed over the next few days. Short messages, partial documents, nothing sensational on its own. Together, they filled in the gaps I'd been stepping around. He had known he was being sidelined. He'd chosen patience over confrontation, law over outrage. The parallels unsettled me. Pressure from my wife's family intensified at the same time. It no longer hid behind concern. Phone calls came with conditions. Information was offered selectively, always with reminders of how complicated things could become if I pushed further. Invitations turned into summons. Silence became accusation. The effort to isolate me wasn't subtle anymore. It didn't need to be. At work, I stayed late more often. The building emptied early those nights, leaving space to think without interruption. One evening, Marcus stopped by after finishing a meeting nearby. He didn't ask how I was holding up. He asked what I knew, then listened as I laid it out carefully, sticking to facts, avoiding conclusions. When I finished, he leaned back and folded his arms. He didn't suggest retaliation. He didn't frame it as a battle. He pointed out options, legal clarity, documentation, distance where necessary. He said the word boundaries like it was practical, not emotional. Something you set, maintain, and adjust, not something you negotiate endlessly. The conversation stayed grounded. No encouragement to burn bridges. No warnings about being the bigger person. Just a reminder that safety built on silence wasn't safety at all. I left with a list of next steps written on a receipt, tucked into my pocket with change I'd forget to use. Attempts to corner me followed quickly. A family meeting proposed with vague urgency. Messages hinting that cooperation now would prevent embarrassment later. Someone suggested mediation, though no one admitted what problem needed mediating. Each approach carried the same assumption, that I would choose comfort over clarity. I weighed that assumption every night. Keeping things as they were promised fewer confrontations, fewer raised voices, fewer visible losses. It also guaranteed more erosion, more decisions made without me, more narratives written in my absence. Control, once surrendered, rarely returned on its own. One evening, after the office lights dimmed automatically, I sat alone reviewing the timeline I'd assembled. Dates aligned cleanly now. The funeral, the sudden concern over my judgment, the restricted account, the bored email. None of it looked random anymore. It looked coordinated. The anonymous sender wrote again, this time referencing a lawyer my father had consulted quietly. The name matched one I'd seen buried in old correspondence. I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I closed my laptop and stood, stretching muscles stiff from hours of stillness. The decision forming wasn't dramatic. It was steady. Outside, the parking garage echoed faintly as I walked to my car. I drove without music, letting the road absorb what needed space. At a stoplight, I opened the note Marcus had given me and read it once more. Each line felt less like advice and more like confirmation. I pulled into the driveway later than planned. Inside, the house was quiet. I set my bag down and checked my phone. Several missed calls. A message waiting, phrased as concern, but carrying expectation. I didn't answer it. Instead, I opened my calendar and scheduled a consultation for the following morning. Before going to bed, I drafted a short email to the anonymous address, acknowledging receipt and asking one precise question. No emotion, no promises, just acknowledgement. I saved it, reread it once, then sent it without ceremony. Lying there afterward, sleep took its time. My mind moved through contingencies instead of regrets. Whatever followed would require effort, patience, and distance from people who expected access they hadn't earned. That understanding didn't frighten me. It clarified things. In the morning, I dressed for work as usual, packed the same lunch, followed the same route. From the outside, nothing had shifted. Inside, the balance tipped quietly as I backed out of the driveway, already running through what I'd need to say first when the office doors opened and the day began. The lawyer's office sat where I could reach it without attracting attention, close enough to work to look routine, far enough from home to feel neutral. I arrived early, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted time to think before speaking. When he came in, we skipped pleasantries. I laid out documents in careful order, explaining how I'd obtained each one and where the gaps still were. He listened without interrupting. That mattered. When questions came, they stayed practical. Dates, signatures, access, authority. He didn't speculate about motives or tell me how unfair it sounded. He explained what could be proven and what couldn't, and how the difference would shape every step forward. I left with a clearer sense of limits and a checklist that didn't rely on anyone's goodwill. Preparation became part of the routine after that. Mornings started earlier. Evenings stretched longer. I scanned files during lunch breaks, cross-referencing names and dates. Calls were returned selectively. When I spoke, I measured words the way I once measured expenses, aware that small details accumulated quickly. Emotion had its place. Strategy demanded distance. My wife noticed the change. Questions surfaced, then frustration. She asked what I was doing and why everything felt guarded now. I answered calmly, explaining that I needed clarity before making decisions that affected more than one person. The explanation didn't satisfy her. It wasn't meant to. Silence, this time, wasn't surrender. It was filtration. Emails arrived from unfamiliar addresses, phrased as concern or curiosity. A few carried thinly veiled warnings about consequences if misunderstandings weren't resolved soon. I archived them without response, tagging each by sender and time. Patterns emerged there too. Timing aligned with meetings I hadn't shared. That told me enough. The anonymous contact sent one more message, brief and factual, confirming details I'd already uncovered. I acknowledged it, thanked them, and asked for nothing further. By then, I didn't need more fragments. The picture held on its own. At work, I tightened processes I'd once left flexible. Approvals required documentation. Access narrowed to those with reason. The changes were defensible, even welcome, framed as efficiency. Watching how some people reacted gave me additional information I hadn't asked for. Resistance always reveals priorities. Late nights became common. The office emptied while I stayed behind, organizing files and mapping timelines across a whiteboard I'd never used before. The exercise wasn't dramatic. It was methodical. Each piece placed where it belonged reduced the noise in my head. Calm followed structure. Not everything stayed contained. Once, walking to my car, I noticed the same vehicle idling nearby longer than necessary. Another evening, an email referenced a conversation I hadn't had with the sender. Subtle signals, easy to dismiss individually. Together, they suggested attention had turned my way. I adjusted again. Routes varied, meetings moved, information shared became minimal. None of it interfered with daily life enough to explain. It didn't need to. Awareness sharpened without tipping into paranoia. The lawyer checked in midweek, updating me on steps underway. He spoke about contingencies, not outcomes. That distinction mattered. Control lived in preparation, not prediction. I asked questions. He answered them plainly. When the call ended, I felt steadier than I had in weeks. One evening, I stood by the office window longer than intended, watching traffic thin below. The city kept moving, indifferent to private reckonings. That indifference helped. It reminded me that this wasn't a performance. No audience needed convincing. Only records mattered. A message from the family thread popped up while I was packing to leave. It suggested another meeting, framed as an opportunity to clear the air. I didn't respond immediately. I read it once, then again, noting what wasn't said. No specifics, no acknowledgement of harm, just urgency. I set the phone down and finished packing. The elevator ride passed in silence. Outside, the night air felt ordinary, unremarkable. Driving home, I ran through the next day's schedule, slotting in calls and tasks with the same care I'd once reserved for family commitments. At home, I placed folders where I could find them easily, then washed a mug I hadn't used. Small tasks anchored me. Before turning in, I reviewed one final document, reading it straight through without stopping. Nothing new appeared. That was the point. Lying awake later, I noticed how little anger remained. Focus had replaced it. Whatever came next would unfold publicly or privately, on terms shaped by what I'd gathered, not what I'd been accused of. The understanding didn't arrive as resolve. It settled quietly, steady as breath, staying with me as sleep finally took hold, and the undercurrent beneath everything else continued to rise. The letter waited on my desk when I returned from lunch, folded once, heavier than its size suggested. Legal language filled the page, clean and restrained, outlining concerns about my involvement in financial decisions tied to the family estate. Someone had filed a formal complaint, not anonymous, not careless, detailed enough to force a response. I read it twice before setting it down. My pulse stayed even, though something older stirred underneath, a familiar tightening I hadn't felt in years. It reminded me of the first time I realized my marriage wasn't built on equal ground, how quickly doubt can slip in when trust erodes quietly. Calls followed within the hour. The lawyer's voice stayed measured as he explained what this meant procedurally. No panic in his tone, just logistics, deadlines, disclosures, a hearing date penciled in, subject to change. He told me this wasn't the end of anything, just an escalation. I thanked him and hung up, already replaying the phrasing from the letter in my head. Family pressure intensified immediately. Messages stacked up, each one carrying urgency without substance. They wanted a meeting. They wanted reassurance. They wanted me to stop whatever I was doing before things went further. The implication sat plainly between the lines. Cooperation now could still contain the damage. At home that night, restraint cracked for the first time. Accusations flew, sharp and personal, cutting past the procedural calm I'd maintained. Old grievances surfaced, reshaped to fit the moment. I listened until words blurred together, then excused myself without finishing the conversation. No door slammed, no final sentence delivered, just distance. Sleep came in fragments. Memories surfaced uninvited, moments when I'd chosen endurance over honesty, believing sacrifice equaled love. My father's voice drifted in too, not as advice, but as presence. He'd carried his own betrayals quietly, believing time and law would sort them out. Maybe he'd been right. Maybe he'd waited too long. The next day unfolded poorly. Another notice arrived, this one threatening my position on a board I'd served faithfully. Nothing proven, nothing concluded, just concern about appearances. I watched years of contribution reduced to a liability in a few careful paragraphs. By afternoon, the weight pressed hard enough to make breathing feel deliberate. I stepped outside the courthouse after submitting preliminary paperwork, the air doing little to clear my head. People passed by with their own agendas, unaware of the recalibration happening inside me. That anonymity should have helped. It didn't. Standing there, I understood how easy it would be to stop, to comply, to smooth things over and accept whatever role remained. The system rewarded that kind of retreat. It always had. The thought tempted me briefly, offering rest disguised as relief. Then another message came through, forwarded by someone who meant well. It repeated a claim I knew was false, stated confidently, already gaining traction. My silence had allowed it room to grow. That realization landed with clarity I couldn't argue with. If I stayed quiet now, the story would finish itself without me. The lawyer called again as I walked toward the parking structure. He updated me on the complaint's origin, careful not to speculate, but clear enough about intent. This wasn't defensive maneuvering. It was pressure applied deliberately, meant to force a retreat. He asked what I wanted to do next. I paused beside my car, keys in hand, considering the question without rushing to fill the space. Images passed through my mind, not dramatic scenes, just ordinary moments I'd surrendered over time. Decisions deferred, boundaries blurred, each concession small enough to justify. Together, they'd led here. "I want to proceed," I said finally. The words came out steady, surprising me with their calm. He acknowledged the choice and outlined immediate steps. I listened, absorbing details, already shifting gears. When the call ended, I sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine, letting the hum of the garage surround me. This wasn't resolve born of anger, it was recognition. Silence had reached its limit. What remained was movement. I drove away from the courthouse slowly, merging into traffic without hurry. The route home felt different, not lighter, but clearer. At a stoplight, I reviewed the day's events, not as losses, but as signals. Escalation meant exposure. Exposure meant truth had a chance to surface. Back at the apartment, I set my things down and opened my laptop, pulling up documents I'd organized weeks earlier. Notes waited where I'd left them, timelines aligned. Nothing new appeared, but everything I needed was already there. I drafted a short message to the lawyer, confirming the next meeting and attaching files he'd requested. No commentary, just facts. After sending it, I closed the laptop and stood, stretching tension from my shoulders. The evening passed quietly. I ate something simple, cleaned up afterward, and laid out clothes for the morning. Routine steadied me. Before bed, I checked my phone once more. Several messages waited unanswered. I left them that way. Lying down, exhaustion finally settled in, not as defeat, but as a signal that something irreversible had begun. Tomorrow would bring responses, questions, resistance. Tonight offered only the space between decisions and consequences. I turned off the light and let the day end there, already moving forward in my mind as sleep came, knowing the next steps would require presence instead of patience, and that this time I wouldn't step aside. The voicemail came through while I was tying my shoes, my phone vibrating against the counter like it had somewhere else to be. The voice belonged to a man who introduced himself carefully, explaining that he'd worked with my father years ago on a limited advisory basis. He said he'd stayed quiet because he'd been advised to, and because no one had asked him directly. Now someone had. We met later that afternoon in a small office he still rented part-time. No sentimentality, no apologies. He laid out what he knew in plain terms. My father hadn't hidden assets out of vanity or mistrust. He'd structured them deliberately, anticipating interference. Certain provisions in the will were contingent on behavior, not time. Compliance mattered. Intent mattered. Silence from some parties had already triggered consequences they didn't yet understand. He slid copies of correspondence across the table, each page stamped, dated, and logged. The handwriting matched, so did the strategy. I recognized my father there more clearly than I had in years, not as a distant figure, but as a man choosing restraint over confrontation, law over noise. Hope surfaced, brief and contained. I didn't let it grow unchecked. Experience had taught me what premature confidence invited. Back in the car, I reviewed what I'd been given, noting how neatly it fit with what I already had. No contradictions, no leaps, just alignment. The will wasn't a surprise twist. It was a mechanism. One designed to expose exactly what was happening now. Pressure from the family didn't ease. If anything, it sharpened. Calls came more frequently, tone alternating between wounded and aggressive. Accusations grew louder as evidence stayed out of reach. They still held surface advantage, access, influence, numbers. Denial remained their shield, paired with counterclaims meant to overwhelm. I didn't engage. Responses went through counsel. When silence returned, it felt different this time. Not empty, focused. The lawyer reviewed the new material that evening. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He nodded once and began mapping implications. The documents didn't just support my position. They weakened theirs in specific, provable ways. Certain actions they'd taken crossed thresholds they couldn't walk back from. Greed leaves traces, always does. Paper trails, overreaches, assumptions that no one will look closely enough to connect them. My father had counted on that. Preparation shifted from collection to sequencing. What to reveal, when, through whom. Timing mattered more now than volume. We discussed possible reactions, not in theory, but in likelihoods. They would deny, they would reframe, they would accuse. Each move had an answer ready. On the drive home, traffic crawled, giving me time to think without trying. I wasn't angry. That surprised me. The anger had burned itself out earlier, replaced by something steadier. Recognition, maybe. Or acceptance that this had always been where patience led when it went unguarded. At home, I organized the new files, integrating them with what I'd already assembled. The picture held firm. No missing corners, no blurred edges. For the first time since the funeral, the uncertainty loosened its grip. Another message arrived from the family thread, demanding a response before things went too far. The wording implied control they no longer had. I read it once and left it unanswered, placing the phone face down beside the stack of documents. Later, I stepped outside to take a call from the lawyer confirming the next day's meeting. He outlined how the confrontation would unfold procedurally. Who would speak? What would be presented? Where silence would matter most. It sounded less like a showdown and more like a correction. That distinction mattered. When the call ended, I stood there for a moment, noticing how little I needed reassurance. The facts were enough. Whatever followed wouldn't be about convincing anyone of my worth. It would be about establishing what had already been set in motion. Inside, I packed a folder with the essentials and left the rest where it was. Over-preparation had its limits. Sleep came easily that night, not deep but uninterrupted. The mind, once aligned, doesn't fight rest the way it used to. Morning arrived without ceremony. I dressed, ate, and left on schedule. The drive downtown felt ordinary, which felt right. This wasn't a special day, it was a necessary one. As the city closed in around the car, I reviewed the sequence once more, not out of doubt, but habit. Each step had its place, each silence its purpose. Pulling into the garage beneath the law offices, I gathered the folder and shut the door behind me. The elevator ride passed quietly, numbers ticking upward without commentary. When the doors opened, I stepped out, adjusted my grip on the documents, and walked toward the conference room where everything I'd been avoiding would finally be addressed. The room filled slowly, chairs scraping, papers settling into neat stacks. I took a seat near the end of the table, without drawing attention to myself. No one greeted me directly. That was fine. The notary reviewed formalities while side conversations hummed quietly, confidence radiating from people who believed the outcome was already decided. When the reading began, I kept my eyes on the document, not on the faces across from me. Names appeared, dates followed, clauses unfolded in careful sequence. The language stayed precise, unemotional, immune to pressure. With each paragraph, I felt old sensations stir. Moments when I'd been dismissed, spoken over, reduced to convenience. They surfaced and passed without taking hold. A pause came midway through, the kind that invites interruption. Someone took it. A comment slipped in, framed as clarification, but sharpened by implication. Questions about my role, suggestions that I'd misunderstood my father's intentions. The attempt wasn't subtle. It was designed to steer the room before facts settled too firmly. The notary acknowledged the remark and continued. Silence reclaimed the space, not mine this time, but procedural. Provisions tied to behavior followed next. Conditions triggered by interference, safeguards against mismanagement. As those sections were read, posture shifted around the table. Confidence thinned. Pens paused mid-note. When the assets were listed, the atmosphere changed completely. Not because of their scale alone, but because of how they were structured. Trusts layered with oversight. Control assigned clearly. Authority defined without ambiguity. I heard a breath catch somewhere to my left. Then came the final attempt, an accusation delivered calmly, almost kindly, suggesting I'd manipulated events to secure advantage. It was the last card they had. I recognized it immediately, not for its strength, but for its timing. Too late, too loud. My lawyer responded before I did, placing documents on the table with deliberate care. Each one corresponded directly to the claim just made. Dates aligned, signatures matched. The trail told its own story without commentary. When it was my turn, I spoke briefly, correcting one factual error and letting the rest stand on record. No argument followed. There was nothing left to argue against. The notary resumed, finishing the reading as written. The outcome settled into place, not as surprise, but as confirmation. Authority transferred, control established. The mechanisms my father had set in motion completed their cycle. Reactions varied. Shock appeared quickly, followed by denial, then calculation. Someone demanded explanation. Someone else asked for reconsideration. Neither request belonged to me. I didn't answer them. The document had already done so. As the meeting concluded, chairs moved again, louder this time. Papers gathered hastily. Voices rose, then dropped. I remained seated until it was appropriate to stand, collecting my things with the same care I'd used when arriving. Walking out didn't feel triumphant. It felt clean. In the hallway, one of them caught up to me, voice strained, asking how I could do this to family. The question carried years of assumption, as if boundaries were betrayal and access was owed. I stopped long enough to meet their eyes, then continued without replying. The elevator ride passed without conversation. When the doors opened, the lobby absorbed us all equally. Outside, people dispersed in different directions, urgency pulling them away. I headed toward my car, aware of the weight I was no longer carrying. Inside the vehicle, I sat for a moment before starting the engine, letting the quiet settle. Messages would follow. Calls would come. Consequences would unfold. None of that required immediate attention. I pulled into traffic and drove away from the building, the route familiar, the movement steady. At a stoplight, my phone buzzed once, then went still. I didn't check it. The afternoon stretched ahead with ordinary obligations waiting. Work, paperwork, decisions that no longer required permission. As I merged onto the expressway, the sense of exposure I'd carried for weeks faded, replaced by something simpler. Not relief, not victory. Space. I adjusted my grip on the wheel and focused on the road, already shifting back into the rhythm of daily life, knowing the silence I'd chosen now belonged to me, and that it would carry forward into whatever came next without needing to announce itself. The days after the reading settled into a strange calm. Not peace, not relief, just the absence of noise that had filled every corner for months. Paperwork replaced speculation. Calls came from attorneys instead of relatives. Decisions moved through proper channels without emotional leverage attached. The system did what it was designed to do when no one interfered. I learned quickly how much of my life had been shaped by avoiding discomfort. That was the weakness I hadn't wanted to name. Not anger, not fear, accommodation. The habit of bending early so things wouldn't break later. It had felt responsible, mature. What it had actually done was invite others to decide where my limits were. The consequences for them unfolded without my involvement. Accounts were audited, access revoked. A few arrangements dissolved quietly once scrutiny arrived. Public confidence thinned as explanations failed to hold up. I didn't track the details closely. Knowing they existed was enough. Outcomes didn't need witnesses. At home, distance grew into separation without ceremony. Conversations shortened, then stopped. No final argument marked the end. Just the recognition that whatever we had relied on silence to survive, and silence no longer worked in that direction. I packed what mattered over a few evenings, leaving behind what didn't feel like mine anymore. Work continued. Responsibilities expanded instead of shrinking. People who'd waited to see how things would land adjusted their posture once facts replaced rumors. Respect returned in small, practical ways. Fewer questions, clearer exchanges. Nothing dramatic, just steadier ground. One afternoon, with time between meetings, I drove toward the lake without planning to. The route felt familiar, like something I'd done before another version of myself took over. Parking near the water, I stepped out and walked until the city noise thinned enough to think without interruption. Sitting on a bench, I watched people pass without attaching stories to them. That used to be my habit, imagining motives, anticipating needs. I let it go. The exercise felt lighter than expected. What stayed with me was a clearer sense of responsibility. Not the kind that absorbs everything indiscriminately, but the kind that chooses deliberately. My father had understood that distinction better than I had. He'd trusted law and time more than proximity. I finally understood why. A message buzzed once, then stopped. I didn't check it. The need to respond immediately had faded. Control didn't come from speed. It came from alignment. Before leaving, I made one call, short and factual, confirming the last outstanding matter. When it ended, I sat there a moment longer, feeling how ordinary the decision felt. No surge, no emptiness, just completion. Driving away from the lake, traffic moved steadily. I merged without hesitation, letting routine reclaim its place. The road led back toward responsibilities that were mine by choice now, not obligation. That evening, I returned to a space that still echoed slightly, boxes stacked neatly along one wall. I unpacked a few essentials, then stopped. There was no rush to fill the room. Space had earned its place. Later, standing at the sink, I washed a glass and set it on the counter to dry. Small tasks grounded me more than reflection ever had. The phone stayed where I'd left it, silent. Before turning in, I reviewed the next day's schedule, adjusted one meeting, and closed the calendar. Lights went off one by one. Nothing followed me into the dark, except the steady sense of having stepped out of something that no longer fit. Sleep came easily. Morning would arrive with its usual demands, and I would meet them without the weight I'd mistaken for duty. The life ahead didn't promise ease, but it no longer asked for erasure either. I lay there a moment longer, listening to the quiet I'd finally earned, then reached over to set the alarm, already moving forward without needing to look back.